Hello everyone. Welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy's daily newspaper analysis. Today is 5th January 2025. We have a list of topics for today's discussion. So let's understand these topics in detail. The first topic is India's fight against left-wing extremism. So we all knew that the areas where left-wing extremism is prevalent is called as red corridor. So this left-wing extremism is highly prevalent form of internal security threat for India. However, so far India is largely successful in fighting against left-wing extremism. Now in this context, we'll be understanding what are the main causes of left-wing extremism, how it has emerged, and how India successfully fought against this, and what steps are required. So everything we are going to understand in this session. So firstly, if we talk about the left-wing extremism in India, it is widely prevalent in some states like Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Jharkhand, parts of Bihar. So the main reason for the left-wing extremism is the neglect of the tribal areas, exploitation of resources in tribal lands. So therefore, these are some factors which are mainly responsible for the left-wing extremism. So main factors in the sense that, for example, I would say administrative or bureaucratic apathy, lack of development or neglect of the tribal areas, extraction or exploitation of mineral resources in the tribal areas, lack of proper rehabilitation and resettlement, poverty, lack of education, lack of healthcare facilities. So these are some factors which have led to the growth of left-wing extremist movement. In India, the left-wing extremist movement grown in 1960s and 1970s extensively. And in fact, as I've already told you, that there are around 10 states where this left-wing extremism is widely prevalent. The most prominent states among them are Odisha, Chhattisgarh, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, and Jharkhand. So these are the states, including other states, is widely considered as red corridor. Red corridor is a region where this left-wing extremist movement is widely prevalent. So unfortunately, these left-wing extremist forces have adopted the path of violence against the state. They have adopted the violence against the state, and their objective is largely to overthrow the democratically elected government or to protect the tribal rights. However, over the years, the state is largely successful fighting against the left-wing extremism. Why? Because in recent times, the incidents of left-wing extremism have largely declined. Now, in this context, let's understand India's fight against left-wing extremism. Now, in fact, so this left-wing extremism is also commonly called as Naxalism. This Naxalism has posed challenge to India's internal security. Former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, he also called rightly that Naxalism or left-wing extremism is topmost internal security threat for India. It's not just a threat for internal security, it also affects governance or delivery of welfare schemes in tribal areas. So that is the main problem here. Now, as I have already told you that these tribal dominated areas, there is a prevalence of left-wing extremist movement or Maoist movement. So state is largely successful fighting against this left-wing extremist movement. So this can be evident from the fact that if you look at the data, the Maoist related violence in recent times, it has substantially declined. So in fact, the government data reveals that around 90% decline in the violence incidents committed by the left-wing extremist forces from 2010 to 2025 in between. And now the insurgency or left-wing extremism only remained in few pockets of Odisha, Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand. Now let's understand this in detail. So let's understand the decline in red corridor with some data. Now, in fact, in 2013, left-wing extremist districts throughout India, 182 districts. So these 182 districts are left-wing extremist districts in the year 2013. But this number has reduced to just 18 districts in 2025. So you could see here this area which is marked in red color, it is a red corridor, and by 2025 how this red corridor has shrinked. So therefore only a few pockets of red corridor still exists. So state is largely successful fighting against this left-wing extremism. So let's understand this from some other data from the government. So in fact, the geographical spread of left-wing extremism has substantially declined or contracted. Because now, as per some data, the left-wing extremist affected districts in the year 2018, it was around 126 districts. So these 126 districts are called as red corridor. However, by 2025, this number has substantially reduced to just 11 districts are now left-wing extremist affected districts by the year 2025. So even within these 11 districts, there are some states within Chhattisgarh and Odisha which are extremely affected by the left-wing extremism. For example, Bijapur, Narayanpur and Sukma districts. So these are extremely affected by the left-wing extremism. Otherwise, in the remaining districts, there is a very less prominence or presence of left-wing extremism. Now, in fact, this is a substantial decline in the violence or left-wing extremist related incidents. And apart from that, there is a substantial decline in the districts which are affected by the left-wing extremism. So therefore, you could see that there is a significant shift that you could actually observe. Now earlier, this area is particularly known as Dandakaranya region. So Dandakaranya region is a stronghold of left-wing extremism. But now this Dandakaranya region red corridor is further shrinking. So therefore, this is a significant shift and a success of the outcomes, both security plus developmental outcomes that the government has adopted, and that has largely resulted in the shrinking of this left-wing extremism in the country. Right, now let's understand why this Dandakaranya region is a stronghold for the Maoist forces. There are some reasons for that. Now in fact, it is having a rugged terrain. Rugged terrain is one reason, and having interstate borders is another reason. For example, the Odisha, state of Odisha, Chhattisgarh, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh. So this is interstate border, and even the administrative neglect or administrative apathy. So all these factors are the result of Dandakaranya becoming a Maoist stronghold. So let's first understand the root causes of this left-wing extremism in these red corridor areas or certain pockets. For example, social exclusion or isolation of the tribal populations, it could be one factor. Now, social exclusion because most of the people are scheduled tribes, and apart from that, there is lack of development. Lack of development essentially means that there is no connectivity. There's no internet, there's no educational facilities, there's no health facilities. So because lack of education, lack of healthcare, lack of connectivity, there were no industries. There were no industries and no employment as well. And large scale gender gap was also existing. However, this could be a secondary reason, it could not be a primary reason. However, within these tribal areas, to protect their tribal rights, the forest rights, several tribal populations have also launched Jal Jungle Jameen movements. So this could be another major reason for large scale influence of these tribal populations to be part of the left-wing extremist movement. And as I've already told you, that there's lack of infrastructure. There's no roads, no connectivity, no internet, and no schools, no healthcare facilities, nothing. And then generally bureaucratic apathy is also existing. So bureaucratic apathy essentially means that there is a general neglect of bureaucracy over these areas. So this bureaucratic apathy has led to these tribal areas facing several issues. This could be another major problem, lack of education, and there's also a large scale corruption, particularly illegal mining, which has been taking place in these tribal areas. So illegal mining or exploitation of the resources within these tribal belts very often leads to the rehabilitation of or displacement of the tribal communities. You could say displacement. So once they are displaced, the government is not making any efforts to rehabilitate and resettle these tribal communities. This could be another major reason, and even violation of the human rights of the people, poverty, and poor health facilities. So these are all the factors combining which have led to emerging left-wing extremism in certain parts of India. Right. So how India dealt with the left-wing extremism? So in fact, there is a security-centric interventions along with the development-centric interventions. So the combination of both security-centric intervention plus development-centric interventions have resulted in a large-scale success in the fight against the left-wing extremism. Right. So how the security-centric interventions have resulted in a success in fight against left-wing extremism. So let's first understand this. Now, in fact, as part of the security-centric mechanism, there has been a large-scale establishment of security camps. For example, in Chhattisgarh, there are several districts which are actually a stronghold of these Maoist forces. Now, in those districts, these security camps have been largely established. So those districts and even forested areas also, security camps have been established. Now in fact, these areas are earlier the stronghold of Maoist or left-wing extremist forces. Now through establishing these security forces, the security footprint has substantially increased. For example, there is increased mobilization of security forces into these security camps. And the police and population ratios in those tribal belts have also significantly increased. So therefore, the police or the security forces have a psychological advantage or edge as well. Now, in fact, there is a quick response in case of attacks committed by the Maoists. And apart from that, whenever there is a quick response, it has been resulting in insurgents going into the defensive mode. And at the same time, this quick response, that too with the advanced systems, like for example, drones are being used, advanced weapons are being used, right? So because of all these reasons, there is a psychological advantage for the security forces over the left-wing extremist forces, right? So in fact, it has also used a combination of human intelligence as a local confidence in the state. It has further increased the morale of the security forces. A combination of all these factors have finally resulted in the success of security forces against the left-wing extremism. Right. So because of these factors, in recent times, there has been increased surrender of Maoist cadres. And then neutralization of cadres has also taken place. And in fact, disruption in funding and arms networks. So earlier there might be some arms networks which used to supply arms to these Maoist groups, but the government and the law enforcement agencies have taken a strict action to halt or to stop funding and also arms networks supplying arms to these left-wing extremist forces. So when they don't have arms, it will be very difficult to continue their fight against the security forces. So all these factors have further weakened the Maoist organizational capacity. So this is how the security-centric interventions have actually helped addressing this issue. However, along with the security-centric interventions, there are development-centric interventions and the governance outreach as well. So this has also resulted in further fragmenting the Red Corridor. Now, how the developmental interventions have been taken forward in this context. For example, as we have understood, there is no connectivity. There's no mobile connectivity, no internet connectivity, no road connectivity. So they remain isolated. So the government started developing or constructing roads. The government started establishing mobile towers. And the government started focusing on providing basic infrastructure for those people who are living in these tribal belts. So basic infrastructure includes, for example, housing, drinking water, electricity, electricity, mobile connectivity, internet connectivity, education, healthcare. So these all facilities the government started providing to these tribal people. So earlier these areas are inaccessible areas, but now they are no longer inaccessible. They are well connected with the nearby cities or urban areas. Now we all knew that these security centric interventions are largely successful in fragmenting the left wing extremist movement and its presence largely. So the success is followed by the interventions made from the governance side as well. So what interventions were actually made in the governance side? For example, the collectors, tehsildars, patwaris, in these tribal belts, they started directly engaging with the tribal communities to win their trust and confidence, and that is also a very important. So as I've already told you, that it is actually the combination of security centric interventions plus the developmental measures that have been adopted in this particular place. So therefore this has actually helped replace the Maoist parallel governance. What exactly is Maoist parallel governance? For example, imagine a Bijapur district in the state of Chhattisgarh. So in Bijapur district, so it is completely the Maoist dominated district. So generally in this particular district, since it is Maoist affected district, so Maoists actually have a strong hold over the governance than the actual government there. Right, so they actually established parallel government. They are running parallel government. They also have courts called Janata courts to decide on the issues, the disputes. So that is the parallel government. So therefore these strong measures have actually helped replace these parallel governments in the Maoist stronghold with legitimate state institutions and state control in these areas. Right, so however, in order to address these structural and rights-based issues, so there is a need to adopt certain measures. So what measures need to be adopted in this context? Right. So in fact, it is true that the red corridor has been shrinking. It has been further fragmented. Security measures have been giving right results. But there are some structural issues. So there is a need to address these structural issues through constitutional and even the legislative measures, right? So therefore, the communities emerge out of isolation. So earlier there was a kind of an isolation. They are not well connected with the other areas, but these communities now emerging out of isolation, and they have rights over the land, right? So rights over the minor forest produce. So therefore there is a need to recognize the rights of the tribal communities. That is very important, the rights over the forests. And in fact there is a need to strengthen the local self-governance institutions, particularly through instruments such as PISA Act of 1996. This PISA Act of 1996, it provides for panchayat establishment in scheduled areas. And the PISA Act provided for the Gram Sabhas, and Gram Sabhas are institutions of direct democracy at the grassroots level. Gram Sabhas better know the problems of each of these tribal villages, so thereby empowering the local communities, the local populations through Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act and even the Forest Rights Act of 2006. There is a need to implement both Forest Rights Act and Panchayat Extension to the Scheduled Areas Act. So as of now, several Maoist cadres were surrendered, and several Maoist cadres were also neutralized by the police forces. Now in this context, these surrendered Maoists are also expressed their willingness to pursue tribal rights, to fight for the tribal rights through democratic means, for example contesting elections, for example a peaceful protest. So this could be a democratic means instead of adopting violence. However, there is a need for a transparent, inclusive and mature governance in these tribal belts to completely declare a win against this left-wing extremism, which is a major internal security threat for India. However, the government has actually launched several operations, several missions to fight against left-wing extremism. For example, Operation Samadhan. So Operation Samadhan is an operation that has been launched by the Ministry of Home Affairs to fight against the left-wing extremism. And several state governments on their own have actually launched the surrender policy. So those Maoists who are ready to surrender, so they will be provided some financial incentive. They'll be provided some livelihood options. So surrender policy has also been launched. And all these programs are actually giving right results, but there is a need for mature governance, inclusive, transparent, and holistic governance is required in these tribal areas. So the next very important topic is child marriages and the issue of child marriages in India. So let's understand the child marriage problem. What exactly is a child marriage? Now, child marriage is widely prevalent in India, and in fact India is the topmost country in terms of child marriages. So this is a serious social challenge, a social issue that India has been facing. So child marriages also have a worst effect on the education, learning outcomes, intergenerational poverty, and even the health of a girl child. So therefore, let's understand about this child marriage in detail and the prevalence of child marriage in some states like Assam, West Bengal, Jharkhand, UP. Right. So first thing is that child marriage is a social evil. This is a social challenge. There is no doubt about that. However, in India, we have a law to prohibit child marriage, and there are some welfare interventions from the government side. So there are welfare interventions or welfare schemes to prevent child marriages, plus there is a legal prohibition of child marriage which is actually existing in India. So despite both these measures, there is a large scale prevalence of child marriage, and that is the problem. Now in this context, what is the issue with the child marriages? So child marriages, particularly the girl child, it violates the rights of a girl child. For example, right to education. The right to education is violated by the child marriage, and the right to health is affected by child marriage, and it even perpetuates the intergenerational poverty. So what exactly is this intergenerational poverty? So the poverty which is transferred from one generation to another generation. For example, imagine a girl child was married, violating her right to education, and it also violates her right to healthcare as well. So once this girl child is married, so at a very young age, so she may face health complications. She may not educate herself. So because of that reason, she may not be able to earn any income. So if she is not able to earn any income after her marriage, so if she continues to face problems due to her health, in case of pregnancy, so because of all these problems, the girl child will remain poor, and girl child's kids will also remain poor. So this is actually transferring poverty from one generation to another generation, is intergenerational poverty. So however, in fact, the sustainable development goals, so UN has provided for a sustainable development goals, and these sustainable development goals are 17 goals, and 17 goals must be achieved by the 2030. So this is what is called as UN agenda or UN SDG agenda of 2030. Now out of these 17 goals, goal number 5.3, it talks about the complete elimination of child marriages. So therefore, India strongly committed to prevent child marriages as per the Sustainable Development Goal number 5.3. So despite the welfare interventions, despite legal prohibition, despite targets such as UN Sustainable Development Goals, the child marriages are widely prevalent in India. Now let's understand some important facts with respect to the child marriages. Now the first attempt was made to prevent child marriage in India was during the colonial times. So during the colonial times, Child Marriage Restraint Act was passed in the year 1929. However, this Child Marriage Restraint Act was amended in 1978. So based on this Child Marriage Restraint Act of 1929, it has actually set a minimum age for a girl child to get married is 18 years and a minimum age for a boy child to get married is 21 years. So if anyone is getting married before 18 years, if anyone getting married, if a male individual who is getting married below 21 years, so it is considered as a child marriage as per Child Marriage Restraint Act of 1929. Right? So however, the problem is that in India, the legal age for girl child is 18 years. The legal age for marriage for a boy child is 21 years. Right? But as per the National Family Health Survey 5, the National Family Health Survey 5 revealing us that about 23.3% of women who are aged 20 to 24 in India were married before the age of 18 years. Right? So they are actually married before the age of 18 years as per the National Family. So it is a reality in every rural area. Right? So despite the welfare interventions, despite the laws which are existing to prohibit child marriage, so it is widely prevalent that a girl child is married before 18 years of age, and this is a crime. This is a crime committed by the parents or any other individual. Now, in fact, in 2006, the Union government enacted the Prohibition of Child Marriage Act (PCMA). The Prohibition of Child Marriage Act of 2006. So it made child marriage a crime, right? So therefore, the Prohibition of Child Marriage Act 2006 has declared the solemnization or those who are conducting the child marriage as cognizable and non-bailable offense, right? So even if it is a parents, even if it is a pandit, whoever conducting this child marriage, so they'll be arrested under a crime which is non-cognizable and non-bailable offense, right? So this is a serious crime, child marriage. So however, in India there are certain states where the child marriage is widely prevalent. For example, states like West Bengal, states like Assam, and even Jharkhand. So these are some states where child marriage is widely prevalent, and we can say that these are actually hotspots of child marriage. And if we really wanted to stop child marriage, and if we really wanted to achieve the sustainable development goal number 5, sub goal of 3, so it is very, very important to focus on these hotspots of child marriage, because these are the states which are actually contributing to the highest number of child marriages. However, if you look at the factors which are actually responsible for the child marriage in India, are the some factors. For example, poverty is a reason. The second reason is the migration of parents from the rural areas to urban areas. For example, if parents are migrating with a girl child, there might be some security issues to that girl child. So they are thinking that why don't we get this girl child married so that we can migrate from rural areas to urban area for a work. So this could be another reason. And apart from that, the third reason is low literacy rates as well. And the fourth reason is religious purposes. There are some religions, within those religions the child marriage is allowed, right? So all these factors along with the social norms are actually perpetuating the child marriage. So these are the most important factors which are actually responsible for the child marriage in India. However, in India we have certain legal and policy frameworks to prohibit, eliminate, prevent child marriage. The first one is PCMA, Prevention of Child Marriages Act of 2006, which is existing, and this criminalizes child marriage, right? So criminalizes child marriage as a non-bailable offense, and it is also a non-cognizable offense. So apart from that, in India there is also POCSO Act, Prevention of Sexual Offences Against Children Act of 2012. So POCSO Act is also having some stringent provisions, those who are sexually assaulting children. So under which the marital sexual relations with a minor are a punishable offense. That too, a stringent penalties are there in this POCSO Act. The third one is there are several state governments which are actually launched the policy interventions to prevent child marriages. For example, West Bengal state government has launched a scheme called Kanya Shri scheme in the year 2013. Right, so under this Kanya Shri scheme, conditional cash transfer would be provided. Conditional cash transfer would be provided to a girl child. So therefore, this conditional cash transfer would incentivize girl child's education, her health care, and it would also help delay her marriage. So in fact, there are around 1 crore beneficiaries under this Kanya Shri scheme. So therefore, several such schemes which state governments have actually launched to change the perspective and perception of parents about a girl child, providing her education, providing her health care, providing her equal opportunities with a male girl child. However, it is very important to change the mindset of society through attitudinal and behavioral changes are actually required in the society. Both attitudinal and behavioral changes are the need of the hour. The society needs to change its perception and perspective about the girl child. Girl child need to be provided equal opportunities along with the men as well. Right. Now in this context, at the grassroots level, in order to change the perception of the society, youth can actually play a very important role. And in fact, at the grassroots level, Gram Panchayat, Gram Sabhas, and Anganwadi workers, Asha workers, they can actually play a very important role in increasing awareness against this child marriages at the grassroots level. For example, in states like West Bengal, particularly a district called Murshidabad in West Bengal, so where there is a high prevalence of child marriages. Now in these districts, there is a need for a community-led action that could help prevent these child marriages. For example, in these districts, there are some adolescent girls who actually played a very important role in preventing child marriages and also creating large-scale awareness among the people, among the parents about the negative aspects of child marriage, and also creating awareness about this Kanya Shri program that has been launched in the state of West Bengal. And they were rightly called as Kanya Shri Yodhas. And in fact, if you ever seen a child marriage, you could actually call 1098 helpline number as well, right? So to prevent these child marriages and protect child's rights, you could also call this helpline number. So there is a need for a coordinated efforts at different levels and different stakeholders within the rural or grassroots level. For example, schools need to play a very important role. The curriculum can also increase awareness about the child marriages, and the Gram Panchayat, self-help group, NGOs, religious institutions. So they are all stakeholders. They need to come together and they need to create a large-scale awareness about these child marriages. And we need to have ideal panchayats which are actually child marriage free, and there is a need to provide rewards to those panchayats as well. However, child marriages also have a worst effect on the education and health of young girl child, right? So in fact, data has been revealed that these child marriages have adverse effect on health outcomes of a young girl child. For example, Murshidabad, a district in West Bengal, has recorded 21% teenage pregnancies in 24-25. So that has declined to 17% in targeted blocks after intensified campaigns. However, the early pregnancies increases the risk of maternal mortality, low birth weight, and even school dropouts. So therefore, it actually undermines the human capital formation in these districts. Now, you could also see that the countries with the highest number of child marriages, India is on the top, followed by Bangladesh and Nigeria, right? So in fact, other countries are poor, underdeveloped countries, but India is one of the country which has the top, which actually has the highest number of the child marriages. However, within India, West Bengal tops the list of states with the highest number of child marriages, followed by Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Assam and Bihar. Right. So the next important topic is Venezuela's crisis and India's energy security. So yesterday we have discussed that Venezuelan president Nicolas Maduro, so he was captured by US forces, and then so he was taken into custody by US, right? So in this context, so vice president of Venezuela now became interim president of Venezuela, and US has also held that it is going to take care of the administration in Venezuela, and apart from that, US would now control the oil fields in Venezuela. So however, let's understand that India is a country which has been importing around 85% of its crude oil requirements from other countries, including Venezuela as well. But one thing is that India is importing less than 1% of its total crude oil imports from Venezuela. So therefore, for India, energy security is a very important aspect. Since India imports less than 1% of crude oil from Venezuela, so this ongoing crisis in Venezuela is not going to affect India significantly. So why? Because India has actually diversified its revenue, diversified its crude oil supply sources, Now imagine that why this diversification of crude oil supply sources is very important. For example, imagine that around 40% of crude oil if India is importing from countries like Venezuela. Now Venezuela is under crisis. So if India is substantially dependent on a country, and if that country goes into crisis or any other issue in that particular country, that also affects India's energy security, because India dependent on one single country. So instead of depending on one single country, why don't we depend on multiple countries to source our crude oil or crude oil supplies? So that makes us resilient. So this is what is called as the resilient. So India can actually become resilient to these shocks. So that's how this diversification of crude oil supplies will help India protect and strengthen its energy security, and that is the issue here. Right. Now, if you look at the context of it, there is a geopolitical instability. There is a geopolitical instability in major oil producing countries, almost all. For example, in West Asia, Israel-Hamas conflict, Russia-Ukraine war. So Russia-Ukraine is also a major oil producing. For example, countries in Africa such as Nigeria. So there is also an internal security issues. There is instability. And for example, Venezuela, which is a country with the largest oil reserves in the world, now it is also under crisis. So therefore, there is a geopolitical instability in major oil producing regions all around the world. However, so this geopolitical instability raised certain concerns for India's energy security and other oil importing countries as well. However, so recently there is a US military action. So US military has captured Nicolas Maduro, who is a president of Venezuela. So heightened tensions in Venezuela, so they're unlikely to affect India's energy security in future. Why? Because India has already diversified its energy supplies. For example, India now importing around 40% of its total crude oil from countries like Russia, followed by Iraq, UAE, US, Nigeria, Angola, Brazil, and Venezuela. It is around less than 1% now, right? So if you look at the data about India's oil imports, India's dependence on Venezuela crude oil has sharply declined over the past 1 decade. There are a number of factors. For example, US has also imposed sanctions on Venezuela. So when US imposed sanctions on Venezuela, India started declining its oil purchase from Venezuela. For example, according to some government sources, India imported only 255.3 million worth of oil from Venezuela in the financial year 2025. Right, so this is just 1.3% of India's total oil imports. So therefore, very less amount of oil that we have been actually importing from Venezuela. However, so in 2013, there's a drastic fall, like around 13 billion worth of crude oil that we were importing from Venezuela, right? So however, by the year 2019, so India has substantially reduced its oil imports from Venezuela, particularly because of the US sanctions and risk of secondary sanctions if India continues to import oil from Venezuela, right? So what are the impact of sanctions and oil characteristics? Let's understand this aspect as well. Now, in fact, Venezuela is a member of OPEC countries. OPEC is Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, right? So however, its role in the global oil market has diminished. Now, if we talk about the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, so it was established in the year 1960, and the founding members of the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries are Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. So these are the founding members of Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. However, it has expanded. Now it has around 13 member states. Now, in addition of another 11 elite major oil producing countries that include Russia, a grouping is known as OPEC plus, right? So now this OPEC plus is a group of 24 oil producing nations. Now, if we talk about the major objectives of this OPEC is coordinate and unify the petroleum policies of its member countries. So they will decide whether they have to increase the oil production or decrease the oil production, and they ensure stabilization of oil markets, and they also secure efficient economic and regular supply of oil. So I hope you have understood what exactly this Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. So as per this OPEC data, Venezuela contributes only about 3.5% of total OPEC exports and just 1% of global oil supply as well, despite having world's largest oil reserves. Now, apart from that, this Venezuelan crude oil is a heavy oil. So heavy oil means which actually requires some specialized refineries, because you cannot directly use crude oil. You need to refine this crude oil, and from after refining it, you will get diesel, petrol, kerosene, all those things. So because of its heavy nature, you require specialized refineries that many countries, including India at present, are not optimally configured to handle this heavy oil, and this could be another factor why, despite having the largest crude oil reserves, so it exports very less amount of crude oil. Consequently, most of the Venezuela's oil exports are directed towards China, further limiting India's exposure to this. Right. Now, in this context, let's understand India's diversification strategy. So as I've already told you that India now no longer dependent on one single country. India has actually diversified its energy import basket. For example, India importing crude oil from countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, UAE, US, Africa, and others, including Venezuela as well. So because if we depend on one single country for crude oil, maybe the geopolitics in that region may affect India's energy security. But if we diversified our energy imports, then we would achieve a resilience with respect to energy security, and that could be the reason, right? So the next topic is India's losses 0.4% of its GDP to natural disasters, right? So let's understand this. This is very important. Every year India is losing around 0.4% of its GDP due to natural disasters. So what exactly are these natural disasters? So disasters are two different types. So one is man-made disasters, second one is natural disasters. For example, earthquake is a natural disaster. Landslide is a natural disaster. Flood, cyclone, drought, heat wave. So these are all some natural disaster, and tsunami can also be a natural disasters, right? So because of these natural disasters, India has been losing 0.4% of GDP every year. This is not the situation that India has been facing. India is only facing, there are several other countries which are vulnerable to these natural disasters. However, the situation is more worse because of global warming and climate change. Both global warming and climate change further increasing the intensity and frequency of these natural disasters. So because of these natural disasters, the infrastructure losses are very common, and losses to other losses to our economy, right? So and social losses, economical losses. So therefore there are number of issues that we have been facing because of these natural disasters. Imagine that, so India planned and developed coastal infrastructure, and India spent around $2 billion for developing this coastal infrastructure. So there is a cyclonic storm or a flood. So because of this cyclonic storm or flood in this coastal area, that has destroyed this coastal infrastructure. That means whatever amount that we have invested, that we have lost. India again need to build the same coastal infrastructure. For example, imagine that the smart cities program has been launched. So because of this smart cities program, so India developed infrastructure into other cities across India. However, the urban floods, we have lost all the infrastructure that has been created under smart cities. Again we need to build. Now one disaster, our infrastructure is wiped out. So because of that reason, we need to again invest in developing infrastructure. So that is the main problem because of these natural disasters. However, if we make this infrastructure resilient to these disasters, then we could invest this money in the social development, right? So we could actually invest this money in social development. For example, we can invest in education, we can invest in health care of the people, and we can invest this in creating additional infrastructure, right? So as I've already told you that India has invested 2 billion in coastal infrastructure, and because of one natural disaster, the 2 billion has been lost. But again we need to build infrastructure, and again we need to spend 2 billion or 3 billion on that. But if we build resilient infrastructure, there is no need to spend additional amount on this infrastructure, and the additional amount can be diverted to social development. We could invest in these sectors. So therefore there is a need for better planning. There is a need for coordinated disaster planning and developing resilient, climate resilient, disaster resilient infrastructure. So that would help us not to lose GDP substantially to these natural disasters. So that's all for today, and thank you so much.